Hello again. A wee interlude at the moment to have a brief discussion about Scotland's Highland Games, myth, tradition and truth. Right? So modern Scotland is very proud of its Highland Games. These are played all over the world, and our brief and often damp summers echo to the sounds of competition, the skirl of pipes and the whomp of cabers. What you see today in the games, what you're seeing in the live stream, was formalised in the early 19th century. And while some claim very, very ancient origins for these games, others suggest that everything was made up by the Victorians. It's merely a pastiche. So what exactly is the truth, and why don't we know? Well, the uncertainty comes from the fact that in the mid to late 18th century, these traditions, the Highlanders, the north of Scotland Gaelic, were despised by Lowland Scots, where the elite in the government was, and they were also actively suppressed by the government in Westminster. Now, all of this followed the failed Jacobite rising of 1745, which culminated in Bonnie Prince Charlie's defeat at Culloden. Sorry for any Outlander fans out there if I've ruined it for you. Incidentally, this also featured the last siege of Stirling Castle, again by Bonnie Prince Charlie, which was on Ladies Rock, which you've either seen or are about to see in our tour. Now, Highland culture and Highland traditions were banned. There was a deliberate attempt to break up the clan system, to smash their culture, and the wearing of tartan was outlawed between 1747 and 1782. Now, all of this takes place before the clearances, which is where the image comes from. The Act of Prescription, so this is the Government Act, this is the government in Westminster, stated, "No man or boy within that part of Great Britain called Scotland will wear or put on the clothes commonly called Highland clothes, that is to say, the plaid, the philibeg or little kilt, trews, shoulder belts, or any part whatsoever of that peculiarly belongs to the Highland garb, and that no tartan or party-coloured plaid or stuff shall be used for greatcoats or for the upper coats." Now, the punishment for wearing a kilt was 6 months in prison. Yes, gee whiz. Or if you were a second offender, transportation to any of His Majesty's plantations beyond the seas, and there to remain for 7 years. It's absolutely incredible. The state and government was so frightened of tartan and kilts, there was a criminal offence to wear them, and a particularly harsh punishment. Now, interestingly enough, tartan was only banned north of the Highland line. Stirling sits just south of this, right? Now, because Stirling's on the Forth and its narrow crossing, it controls the way north or south. If you want to invade Scotland, you do it at Stirling. If you want to stop invasion, you do it at Stirling. So it's no exaggeration to suggest that this, Stirling, Scotland's smallest city, is actually the most important location, the most important strategic location in Scottish history. Its name is sometimes suggested to mean place of conflict, and no other place across Scottish history has so much blood been spent to control such a wee place. Anyway, to return to our story. Around 1759, a local man, William Wilson, started manufacturing tartan to apparently traditional patterns. It may have made up some, and he cornered the market. And in the 1770s, he even got some military contracts. Now, the family eventually had enough money to buy Bannockburn House, which is pictured in the slide, and this was where Bonnie Prince Charlie stayed in 1745 and again in 1746, narrowly missing an assassin's bullet. The same argument about the Highland line was applied to piping, and in 1781, in 1781 a piping competition was held at the massive cattle market at Falkirk. Now, this was where cattle arrived from all across the Highlands to be sold down south. The gradual unification of Scotland with England removed barriers to trade, and the Industrial Revolution meant that people were needed in factories and not on farms, all of which created a massive market for Scottish cattle. And between 1600 and 1889, not my camera bit there, between 1889, the building of the Forth Rail Bridge, at the time the biggest bridge in the world, over 100 million head of cattle travelled through Stirling. Now that is an awful lot of poo. Now, almost immediately after tartan restrictions were lifted, the first modern revival games were held. These were at Inverness in 1788. The first full games, as we might understand them, were in 1819 in St Fillan's in Perthshire. In 1824, very significantly, Walter Scott engineered the visit of King George IV to Scotland, the first monarch to visit the country since the 17th century. We'd really been ignored by that point. And he was presented with a full Highland costume, and a tartan boom was born. Queen Victoria added emphasis to this and then attended her first Highland Games in 1848, and they never looked back. Now, the question for you is, are we really saying that between 1745 and 1782 everything about Highland culture was lost, that we forgot what it was, that people were killed and sent to the plantations? I mean, it is possible. It seems a bit likely. Certainly, we know there were Jacobites still alive. So, for example, the famous composer and violinist Neil Gow, who was 18 in 1745, won a musical competition for his talents, followed Bonnie Prince Charlie's army for a while, and he was later introduced to George IV as his oldest living enemy. However, with the revised games, people began to look for their origins, and in some places they seem to have very, very long traditions. For example, from the 11th century, Malcolm III, pictured in the slide, or rather Malcolm MacDonald, I'm sorry to any Gaelic speakers out there, who was married to Scotland's only royal saint, St Margaret, and who was the Malcolm of Shakespeare's play Macbeth. Well, he proposed a foot race at the majestic summit of Craigconnich, and this appears to be the origin of the Braemar Games, potentially in the 12th century, the 11th century, very interesting. The series games in Fife are considered to be the oldest continuous Highland Games and began in 1314 and have only been cancelled a handful of times. These are sometimes thought to acknowledge the role of the small folk at the Battle of Bannockburn. These were the camp followers, cooks, blacksmiths, and also the people who had arrived too late to be trained by the Bruce, so they probably would have gotten in the way. Now, famously, these people were excluded from the actual fighting on Bruce's orders and were left at the camp on Coxet Hill, which is still standing. This is a medieval royal hunting forest, and there's a line of oak trees and Scots pine, and the pattern was established very, very early on, and there's a charter linking the wood to Robert the Bruce. Anyway, so watching the battle, the small folk saw that the Scots began to win, and that the English were mounting an orderly retreat, so they wanted to get stuck in. The small folk themselves, they then charged the battlefield and arrived significantly, very, very significantly, to the west of the English army, blocking their route to Stirling Castle, which was controlled by English allies. And the English army thought the small folk were a fresh force. So a defeat turned into a rout, and the single greatest victory in Scottish history. More locally, the Earth Games just at the east are thought to be connected to the army camp of the future James IV ahead of his battle with his dad, James III, at Sauchieburn in 1488. Famously, James III died, and James IV was racked by guilt for the rest of his life. And of course, he died at the Battle of Flodden in 1513. There's other evidence, lots and lots of other evidence. A 1703 document from the Clan Grant details the organising of a series of competitions. The attire was to be Highland coats, and you were to wear gun, sword, pistol and dagger. Now, others look to the very, very earliest history of Scotland, and in particular the Club of the True Highlanders constructed a series of fanciful tales about druids overseeing the games, and their book is well worth looking up. You can get a copy online, and it's full of brilliant illustrations, as you can see from this slide, which is a bit dodgy. However, it's clear from the evidence we do have that Scotland was a military society, and its soldiers needed training and competition. The earliest accounts of Stirling are from the Emperor Septimius Severus's invasion of the early 300s. The people who lived here were called the Meathi. The Maiet, the main hill above the city, takes its name from them. Dún Meathi, the fort of the Meathi. Well worth a walk, some excellent views. So, the Roman account says that the Maethi inhabit wild and waterless mountains and desolate and swampy plains, and possess neither walls, cities, nor tilled fields, but live on their flocks, wild game, and certain fruits, for they do not touch the fish which are there plentiful. They dwell in tents, naked and unshod, possess their women in common, and in common rear all their offspring. Their form of rule is democratic, for the most part, and they are very fond of plundering. Consequently, they choose their boldest men as rulers. They go into battle in chariots and have small, swift horses. These are also foot soldiers, very swift in running and very firm in standing their ground. For arms, they have a shield and a short spear, with a bronze apple attached to the end of the spear shaft, so that when it is shaken it may clash and terrify the enemy. They also have daggers. They can endure hunger and cold and any kind of hardship, for they plunge into the swamps and exist there for many days with only their head above water. And in forests they support themselves upon bark and roots. And for all emergencies they prepare a certain kind of food, the eating of a small portion of which, the size of a bean, prevents them from feeling either hunger or thirst. Now, a lot of that stuff is made up. It's to emphasise how hard Scotland was to conquer, how inhospitable it was, though certainly the plunging into swamps and living in tents sounds a lot like last year's games and all that terrible rain we had. However, it is based on first-hand accounts, and those spears with bronze apples at the end of them are drawn on slightly later Pictish symbol stones. So we have one here, and also on the celebrations of Septimius Severus's campaign, they feature the first record of tartan, which survives on a triumphal arch in Morocco and depicts a poor captured Scot in tartan trousers. So it's absolutely clear that soldiers needed to be trained, and that across history we find ever increasing amounts of evidence for this training. Perhaps the most famous form of competition was jousting, and here we have the main jousting ground, the main medieval jousting ground in Stirling. It's currently in the middle of a Victorian housing estate. Jousting competitions were held across Europe. Stirling's most famous example was held in March 1449 by James II. It was very elaborate and very violent. It was linked Stirling Castle to Arthurian legend, which is known as Snowdon. It was apparently a round table. A very detailed account of the joust survives, and we know that much of the fighting took place between the Douglas family and a series of French knights, all watched by the king himself. Now, the fighting involved lances, axes, daggers, until serious injury or death, or the king signalled he had had enough. There were lots of prizes: whoever broke the most lances, whoever hit their opponent on the head 3 times, if you removed an opponent from his horse, and whoever stayed in the field the longest. At the time, the Douglases were jockeying for position, and James was concerned that they were undermining him. His dad had been assassinated, remember. Famously, this all came to a head at the Black Dinner of 22nd of February 1452 in Stirling Castle, when James stabbed the 8th Earl of Douglas and smashed his brains out with a poleaxe, and then threw his body out the window. Now, all of this is supposed to have been the inspiration for the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones. Now, the authorities also recognised that foot soldiers needed training, and a law was passed requiring regular training at so-called Wappenshaws in the 15th and 16th centuries. So locally, Sheriff Muir at Dunblane was used for such practice. More famously, this was later the site of the Battle of Sheriff Muir, as well as the training ground during World War I for troops that went to the Gallipoli campaign. It was also used during World War II for a top-secret military training and research ground in advance of D-Day. It's perhaps the most important event in world history, the end of the Nazis. So it was used to create a model of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, and was used to work out how the wall could be blown up, and thus the troops go. And you can see a slide of it here. Now, I think this is actually the most important archaeological site in Scotland, given the role and significance of D-Day. Anyway, returning to Wappenshaws. Famously, they were not very popular, and people would rather play football and golf. Nothing ever changes. And in 1457, our friend James II banned golf and football in an Act of Parliament, as it distracted them from archery practice. Now, Even as late as the 19th century, training was commonplace, and in this case it's rifle training. It really took off after the French invasion scare of the 1850s. Notably, there was a rifle range under one of the nicer walks around Stirling's King's Park, which is well worth doing, some amazing views to Ben Lomond. Anyway, during the time, people complained that stray shots were pinging past them on their walk, and the range was temporarily closed while they improved things. So, again, returning to this question, why, given this abundant evidence for military training across Scottish history, are games sometimes dismissed as phony replicas of ancient relics rather than a living, breathing tradition? The problem stems from Sir Walter Scott, the British military, and Queen Victoria, and we've got Sir Walter Scott here. They all took real and diverse traditions and competitions, from tartan to tossing the caber, and standardised them. They commodified them. It all looks great, but it has a certain twinge of empire about it, about doing the right thing. Now, if we look in detail at the period, we find that Highlanders of 45 are despised. Their condition, their traditions, their clothing is outlawed. But very, very quickly they're moving from rebels and Jacobites to the disciplined core of the British Army. So, for example, as early as 1759, 4 years after the Jacobite Rising, still in the period of prescription, we find Highland soldiers at the Siege of Quebec in Canada, being described by the leader, General Wolfe, as no great mischief if they fall, i.e. cannon fodder. A further century later, in 1854, during the Crimean campaign, we find the 93rd Highlanders, the ancestors of Stirling's Argyll and Sutherlands, lots of guys who were monoglot Gaelic speakers, forming the Thin Red Line. This is a line of riflemen, firing in discipline, was able to stop a Russian cavalry attack for the first time in history. And here we have the famous picture of the Thin Red Line. Now, the public and the elite were keen to find older origins to these military heroes to ensure that men signed up and would help expand the empire. So then, current military traditions were worked into and mixed up with traditional games, which created what we recognise today. These same patterns and influences were behind the celebration of the Battle of Bannockburn and the construction of the Wallace Monument, the biggest monument to an individual in Britain. However, not everyone was as enamoured with these traditions, or with Scott. Mark Twain famously blamed him for the savagery of the American Civil War. And he accused Scott, of setting the world in love with dreams and phantoms, with decayed and swinish forms of religion, with decayed and degraded systems of government, with the silliness and emptiness, sham grandeur, sham gods and sham chivalries of a brainless and worthless long-vanished society. Oh, come on! That's Scotland he's talking about! Oh, dear. Anyway, so my conclusion is that the Highland Games are a living, breathing tradition, changing and evolving. They are neither relics nor fantasy. Today's live streaming is yet another change, yet another evolution to an ancient form. I hope you're enjoying it. But really, you must come next year and enjoy the real thing. You'll certainly be welcome. Bye for now.